All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour. And this is a story that comes from South Korea, and it's almost a sort of a deja vu, as there's been yet another COVID-19 outbreak in the country that is now being linked to a religious body. Now remember, in the month of February, there was a religious group in the eastern city of Daegu that had resulted in infections of thousands of people. It had set the stage for an outbreak that had raged on throughout the nation. And now it appears that history is repeating itself with a certain church called the Sarangjeel Church in Seoul. Now, the South Korean religious group is the center of the new coronavirus outbreak. It has been accused by the government of withholding key information in the fight against the pandemic. But this new outbreak has also become a hugely contested issue, because the restrictions that have been put to try and contain the coronavirus pandemic, many people say, are also restrictions that are being put on religious congregations. Now, the government of President Moon Jae-in is now fighting off accusations of curbing religious freedom. And this comes as Moon's government has announced a ban on all religious congregations in churches and other religious congregations in Seoul and surrounding areas. This move has also led to a massive backlash from the conservative religious groups. Since the outbreak on the 12th of August, nearly about 1,500 cases have been reported nationwide. Hundreds of these cases have been linked to this one specific religious congregation that had taken place, and about 400 members are yet to be traced by the authorities. Now, the country, which had once controlled the outbreak very successfully, has reported about 288 new cases in just the last 24 hours. Now, there's been a ban on gatherings of general public and rallies in Seoul, and this is also likely to stir up a lot of anger amongst groups that regularly demonstrate in downtown Seoul. The Seoul's government has said that it will seek damages against the Sarangjeel Church and its pastor, Jun Kwang-hoon. Now, the government has accused them of wasting administrative resources and also obstructing contact tracing. Now, with this, the church's pastor is facing criminal charges. June, who's also tested positive for the virus, was even seen outside taking part in these protest rallies. All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what's in fact happening in South Korea, we are joined in by our correspondent Bruce Harrison, who's joining us live from Seoul. Now, good afternoon to you, Bruce. Let me start with the latest information that we are getting. We are being told that Seoul has actually banned all religious congregations of 10 or more people. This, of course, has attracted a lot of backlash from people who say that this is actually a curb on religious freedom. You know, give us a sense in terms of what is playing out in South Korea at this point of time.
Mohammed, it can certainly be framed as that way by many religious people here, in particular Christians, who see this as persecution of their faith and simply a ban on their ability to worship the way they would like. But the government does have precedent for such strict measures. Like you mentioned, if you go back to the first large outbreak in the country in Daegu, that was also tied to a religious group. We saw many more infections at that time than we're seeing now, but the government says it is fearful the numbers now, the hundreds every day over the past week, could erupt into something much larger. The public was fierce in their condemnation of the Shincheonji Church after that first initial outbreak. There was petitions, there was calls from city officials in Seoul to see prosecution of church leaders at that time. And there's a similar sentiment now when it comes to these large churches in Seoul that are defying the government's orders in what most of the public sees as simply ways to keep them safe and prevent coronavirus from spreading. So if the numbers continue to grow and the government continues to try and seek some of these people who are unwilling to be tracked and then tested for COVID-19, it could result in much more backlash against these churches. It's important to say, though, that a lot of churches here are distancing themselves from the group at the center of this latest outbreak. They're saying, hey, we're playing by the rules. We're going to respect the government's social distancing orders. I've spoken with some religious leaders who are not happy about it, but in order to avoid being bunched with a group like Sarangjeel and Reverend Chun right now, they're not going to try and defy any of these bans.
Bruce, it's almost difficult to understand as to why people may not want to cooperate with the authorities, once an outbreak has been confirmed. Do we know as to why people are reluctant in coming forth and saying that, yes, they took part in this religious congregation and potentially could be infected?
Well, there is some precedent as well, Mohammed. When you look back to the Shincheonji episode, that large outbreak in the city of Daegu, a lot of people said they were trying to avoid being traced and tested because they feared persecution from possibly family members or other people in society, because the Shincheonji church has long been viewed by other church communities here, and this is their words, as a cult, as an outsider group. The government has said as much as well, labeled that group a cult, and some of that language has been used to describe the church at the center of the current outbreak. Some people perhaps simply don't want to be associated with that group. Maybe their families don't know they're taking part in a church service like that. Others don't believe that the government is working in their best interests, and they fear that being tested is some sort of conspiracy project. We've heard a lot of different things. The pastor himself has suggested that the virus spreading throughout his church is tied to a government conspiracy. And it's unclear what his followers exactly believe, but many of them we've seen in local media have been told by other members to turn off their cell phones, to spend only using cash, to avoid some of the detection measures the government has used in the past to try and find people so they can be tested and then isolated for COVID-19.
All right, and just before we let you go, Bruce, the entire debate in terms of this new outbreak of the coronavirus infection and also the restrictions that the government now wants to impose on gatherings and congregations, some people say that the government is trying to crack down on religious freedom. How strong is this argument that the government is trying to crack down on religious freedom when the debate should be on how to go about controlling the spread of the coronavirus?
Like I said, obviously there are church communities here that are going along with the government's rules, and I've spoken with some of those leaders and they're not happy with it. But in the short term, they're willing to play along in the hope that the COVID-19 is eventually something we don't have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. If you go before the coronavirus, we didn't see measures like this directed at any large church in particular. Large congregations, mega churches as they're called here, have operated quite freely in South Korea for many, many decades. But at this time, any curb on worship, especially among some of these churches, is seen as religious persecution. But based on the evidence and based on what we've seen South Korea do this year and the way it's acted towards religious communities before, only suggests that they are working towards public health and not something perhaps more sinister when it comes to suppressing any kind of religious belief in this country.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Bruce Harrison, for joining us from Seoul and getting us all those updates in terms of this new outbreak that's taken place in South Korea.